Representing around 290 airlines worldwide, the International Air Transport Association, IATA, has a truly global vocation. It's my pleasure to ask IATA's Director General and CEO, Alexandre de Juniac, to share his thoughts on the main issues the industry is facing worldwide, with a special focus, obviously, on this conference topic, Europe and its competitiveness. Alexandre, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, representative from the Spanish government, dear Henrik, dear Akbar, dear Luis, thank you for being here in Madrid. It's a pleasure for welcoming you in this inaugural Wings of Change for Europe. And Spain is a perfect host country for that because it's a country that has long recognized the potential of aviation, and the Spanish government is a welcome supporter of many of the reforms. We are proud that Madrid is home to our European regional office, probably one of our biggest offices in IATA. And I would like also to thank Iberia, our sponsor, for supporting this event, and the teams of Iberia for helping us. Last month, IATA published our 20-year forecast on passenger trends. You know the figures, but let me remind you of the main ones. In 2037, 1.9 billion passengers will travel in Europe, within Europe, or from Europe. So it's a big number. It's 50% more than today. And that growth will create jobs and will drive a modern economy. But these economic and social benefits will only materialize if Europe provides a playing field on which its airline industry can be competitive. And I'll start by saying that it's not obviously totally the case today in our eyes. Businesses have some levers to improve their competitiveness: cutting costs, improving technologies, hiring new skills, or repositioning the market and the product. But many things in a highly regulated industry, like aviation, are in the hands of governments. And chief among these are the regulatory and tax burdens and availability of infrastructure. If governments make the right decisions, effective regulations, fair taxes, efficient infrastructure, the competitiveness of airlines will improve. More importantly to policymakers, so will the competitiveness of the entire economy. So I am pleased to announce that today we will be sharing the first results from a competitiveness study that our economic teams, under the leadership of the very well-known chief economist of IATA, Brian Pierce, is undertaking. The airline's interest is to provide effective connectivity to link economies, and the study will highlight government policies that achieve this. And Brian will talk more about this later today, and much better than I do. So I will not disclose anything before he does. But I would like to point out a few things. First, as this is the inaugural study, it sets the benchmark for the future. Our plan is to measure progress every 2 years to enable governments to track their progress, and also for us to hold them to account. Second, and equally important, IATA is always at the disposal of governments who wish to work with the industry to find ways to improve competitiveness. There are many examples around the world of nations that have reaped the rewards of a close relationship between government and industry. The tax burden is a key element of competitiveness. The real value of aviation is not in the taxes it generates for governments. It is in jobs and economic growth that flying generates. That is a constant message that we have for governments, including here in Europe. Today's focus is on Europe, so I will make my detailed remarks in 3 areas where the European Union has competency. First, improving air traffic management performance. Second, maximizing the potential of current airport infrastructure. And third, reducing regulatory and cost burdens. Let's start with ATM. This year's ATM performance has been appalling. Delays have reached record levels, as Henrik has reminded of. Passengers deserve better, and we have a 4-point plan for the Commission, European nations, NSPs, and their staff to implement for swift improvement. First of all, reform outdated work practices. I know it's difficult, coming from a country in which work practices are not among the best ones. Second, modernize the ATM infrastructure. Third, empower the European network manager. And fourth, strengthen the performance and charging scheme regulation. As to the medium and long term, airlines are running out of patience waiting for the benefits of the single European sky to materialize. We still believe in this project. We were early believers, we are strong supporters, but we are still waiting. We also see a compelling need for local planning and action. IATA is asking governments to develop national airspace strategies, what we call NAS, aligned with the single European sky benefits that Europe desperately needs. Poland, France, Italy, Bulgaria, and Spain are showing leadership by committing to establish NAS with IATA and other partners. Each NAS, jointly drawn up and governed by the INSP, airlines, and other key stakeholders, sets out investment plans, priorities for tackling capacity bottlenecks and airspace redesign requirements. And I am delighted to announce that later today we will formally publish the first NAS with our partners, Panza of Poland. And we are well advanced with plans to publish 2 more before the end of the year. So we are convinced that this collaboration is essential to build the SES and deliver the ATM performance that European citizens expect. When it comes to airport capacity, Europe's plans for expanding airports are significantly or grossly inadequate. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for structuring how to address airport issues, but there are some basic principles. Airlines need sufficient capacity, alignment with our technical and service requirements, so efficiency, and reasonable costs, meaning affordability. When governments turn to the private sector for the funding needed to achieve these requirements, the situation becomes complicated. It's important to protect the airport's ability to catalyze economic activity. But when considering airport privatization, our members call for governments to think long-term, to be cautious, to regulate appropriately, and consult the industry. That was the intention of a resolution passed at our AGM earlier this year. Since building airport capacity is a long-term project, we also need to manage effectively the capacity that currently exists. That's a major challenge in Europe, which is home to more than half of the world's slot-constrained airports. There is only one fair way to manage slots in an independent, neutral, and transparent system. This is achieved with the current European slot regulation, which is well aligned with the worldwide slot guidelines. I hear some voices suggesting that current regulation is failing and alternatives could do a better job. We don't agree. While I urge change in many areas, my message on slots is to be extremely careful. The current system in Europe enables airlines to consistently plan schedules and aircraft investments. And it has facilitated the phenomenal growth of new entrants like EasyJet, Ryanair, Vueling, Wizz, and others. If there is a problem with all carriers getting their ideal choices of schedules, the fault lies much more in the lack of capacity, not in slot allocation. Changes to the EU slot regulation or inefficient and counterproductive methods of allocation, such as auctions, will not address this issue. The answer is to conduct a regular, impartial, and transparent review of airport capacity with the aim of making more slots available. Another issue that could play havoc with schedules is the issue of daylight saving time in Europe. Without sufficient implementation time, changes to time zones will be disastrous for aviation. Imagine if one EU country stays on summertime while its neighbor switches to winter. And remember, airline schedules are global, so if the hour changes in an EU country but not in the US, then we have a problem. An airline will lose its slots on either end of the route, depending on whether it decides to keep the departure or the arrival time unchanged. Our message is simple: if this change really has to go ahead, something we do not support, it needs to be one synchronized switch across the whole of the EU, and it needs to be done with at least 2 years lead time. Otherwise, we predict a mess in the schedule, the arrival time, the departure time for 1 billion passengers, 1.2 billion passengers. And how will we be able to justify that in their eyes? So obvious issue that we are dealing so badly. So we should do that properly. Europe is beset with burdensome regulations, but two in particular restrict European aviation competitiveness: the Airport Charges Directive and the EU 261 passenger right legislation. The European Commission has wisely recognized that both need reform. The Charges Directive has not kept airport charges competitive. Over the last decade, passenger charges have doubled as a proportion of the ticket price. One thing everyone agrees on is that airports, which have very strong market power, need to be regulated. The key is to agree the principles for establishing which airports need regulating and a way to make that regulation effective quickly. EU 261 is still a mess for airlines and passengers, and a bonanza for claims agencies and their dubious practices. The Commission has tried to help with its guidance material, but the European Court of Justice continues to issue intolerable interpretations which do nothing to improve competitiveness or protect the long-term interests of travelers. A wholesale reform of EU 261 is needed, taking ample input from airlines and consumers. One final regulatory and cost point. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the aviation industry's far-sighted commitments to achieve carbon-neutral growth from 2020 and to cut carbon emissions by 50% of 2005 levels by 2050. In 2016, in line with this goal, we adopted CORSIA in the frame of ICAO. And Europe can take a lot of credit for pushing CORSIA through. But as we have seen recently, international treaties can be precarious. So we must remain united to ensure CORSIA and the multilateral approach agreed in ICAO is not undermined. That means all states fully implementing the scheme's international standards and resisting proposals for unilateral national carbon taxes that could weaken the rationale and resolve for an effective global scheme. And we see popping up here and there in Europe some tax projects on environment which are a bit worrisome, very worrisome from our perspective. And let's never forget that as a global scheme, CORSIA will deliver far greater CO2 mitigation than any domestic policy could hope to achieve. As you know, and as Henrik reminds us of, I call aviation the business of freedom. The business part is clear from the evidence of the 718 billion euros in economic activity and the 12.2 million jobs which are supported by airlines in Europe. The freedom air travel affords the world can be quantified in many different ways. But one example would be the increase in air connectivity that has brought Europe together in the 30 years since the collapse of the Berlin Wall. That openness is precious. Retreating behind new walls cannot be the answer. Protectionism can never be a solution to our economic challenges. This philosophy is being tested in the context of Brexit. There is a real danger that air links between the UK and EU could be severely damaged if an agreement is not found. Both the EU and the UK have said that they value continuity and connectivity. They must match their words with deeds and be far more transparent with the state of the discussions. As a conclusion, why do we call this conference Wings of Change? Why? Because the airline industry is transformative. We change national economies, we change perceptions of distance, geography, and the boundaries of what can be accomplished. This industry is also going through an unprecedented period of change. Revolutionary new business models and digital technologies are transforming aviation beyond all recognition. But we are also calling for change. We need governments and regulators to change their attitude towards aviation, to change their policies, to change their ambitions, so that together a more competitive industry can create the prosperity that changes people's lives. Thank you.